Welcome to the Reed Smith podcast, Career Footprints. In each episode of Career Footprints, we'll ask our guest, a Reed Smith alum, to share their career story, how their time at Reed Smith set them up for success, and their advice for early career lawyers. Our goal is to surface insights from the careers of these inspiring professionals that will help you find professional success, however you define that. Welcome to another episode of Reed Smith's Alumni Career Footprints podcast. I am your host, Lauren Hakala, Reed Smith's Global Director of Learning and Development. And today I'm excited to be speaking with Reed Smith alumni, Stuart Kuntz. Stuart is Associate General Counsel, M&A and Ventures at a company that many of our listeners will be very familiar with, and that's Footlocker. He joined Footlocker 2.5 years ago after spending about 17 years in legal roles of increasing responsibility at Verizon. Earlier in his career, Stuart practiced as a transactional associate here at Reed Smith. Stuart, how are you today?
Hi, Lauren. I'm doing great. Thanks.
So I'd like to start by asking you just about your current role at Footlocker. How do you spend most of your time, and who do you mainly interact with during your work days there?
I spend most of my time, I'm a transactional lawyer, spend most of my time on M&A transactions. I spend a certain amount of time on international franchising transactions as well. I also, as part of my role, I support our treasury group. So I do spend some time, not as much, but sometimes supporting treasury, either with regard to our credit facility or other agreements or questions they have. So that's the bulk of my practice at Footlocker. There's an occasional commercial contract I need to help out with, a little this, a little that. But I would say the bulk of it is disposition work, international franchising, and some treasury support.
So it sounds like you are a real deal lawyer. And I'm curious, how would you describe your style or your approach to helping your clients get transactions done and closed?
It's a lot of, we talk about style and approach. You somewhat want to mirror your client's style and approach, and it can change from deal to deal. There are transactions that, we have to take one for the team. Essentially, this is something we got to get done, and, we're going to have to bite our lip and do it because it's critical. And, generally, disposition of business that just isn't strategic, for example, you're going to have to get done. There are others that are, more nice to haves where you can take stronger negotiation positions. And it also depends on the counterparty. There are people who are, very easy to deal with, commercially reasonable, professional people. There are people who, can be very difficult and, everything's a fight. And there can be people who, maybe they're not difficult, but they're not particularly sophisticated. And there's a lot of almost educating the other side when you're doing a deal. So it varies from transaction to transaction, but, you try to get a feel for the deal. I try to be collaborative. I try to generally be fairly reasonable. I don't start from where I think I'm going to end up, but I would not necessarily set out an agreement that has every single issue, biased in my favor in extreme ways because it's just not productive. So, I would say, try to start, kind of, somewhere near where you think you're going to wind up. You get exceptions here and there, but that's kind of my style, collaborative, approachable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm hearing a lot of almost like situational awareness, right? And being able to read a room and adapt your style. So I definitely want to come back to that later when we talk about your advice for junior lawyers.
Sure.
So you started your career as a law firm associate, like I did, and you were including at Reed Smith.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, when and why did you decide to move to an in-house role?
I moved in-house probably about 6 years into my practice, which I think is fairly typical for, associates. I don't think it's particularly unusual. I went originally to MCI, which was a predecessor company of Verizon. They were bought by Verizon fairly shortly after I got there, actually. I like the idea of having one client, really getting to know your client's business, your client's style, your client's, pain points, even your client's neuroses, because, everyone's got neuroses, and, just knowing your clients is helpful. I like the idea of being involved very, very early on. The idea of kind of even giving strategic thought to, deals and whether we should do it and how it should be done are things I really enjoy about being in-house, and reasons I thought I wanted to go in-house. After 6 years, I got to the point where I knew how to run a deal. And so I didn't need hand holding to actually do the nuts and bolts of running a deal, which is important because in-house there isn't, that level of support that you get at a law firm from more senior lawyers, who you're doubled up with on a deal, teaching you how to do a deal. It's, this is your transaction, call me when it's done. So, you know, I think, a lot of that I liked. There are things, about the law firm life that I think long term probably were not going to be for me. I never saw myself as a big rainmaker, being able to bring a lot of business. If something's not a concern in house, obviously, I'd be honest, I don't miss the billable hour.
I've
Yeah, I mean,
never
just
heard anyone say that they do.
I know, I know. Look, my time is my time, and I do my work. If I'm busy, I'm busy, I'm busy, and if I'm not, I don't stress about not making hours. I just whatever comes, I take care of it, and I don't have to track it or worry about it, or even really pay attention to it. Today, after being in house for 20 years, I have no idea how much I spend on something. I just do it however long it takes.
Yeah, no, I like what you said about being a sixth year and knowing you could run a deal and, being ready to do that at the company. So when you landed at MCI and you had that kind of expectation, was it what you thought? Did anything surprise you about in-house practice?
It was a lot of what I thought. Couple of things, I guess when you think about surprising, the level of support is not what it is in a law firm. And that took a little bit of adjusting is, there's no word processing department. The level of support staff for the legal department is much, much smaller. So you're a little bit more on your own in those ways, or you somewhat rely on outside counsel in those ways. Learning how, there's certain skills I wasn't prepared for. Learning how to manage outside counsels is nothing you experience in a law firm. So you kind of learn that on the fly, talking to other in-house lawyers. How do you kind of keep control of that process? How do you need to prioritize your outside counsel. They're not going to know necessarily. So that was a skill that, I think was new to me, and maybe, something I really hadn't thought about before I came on board as well. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And so it sounds like you did have some learning to do about the new
Yeah.
role.
Oh yeah, sure.
And fast forward like nearly decades later, you're now associate GC. So you moved up consistently. What do you think it was that you did right looking back that allowed you to become, quite senior now?
I think it's a number of things. Do good work, right? No matter what you're doing, do good work. Be a good deal lawyer. Those skills are always valued. Develop good relationships with your internal counterparts, whether it be your clients, which are probably your most important relationships, but with other lawyers in the legal department. As an M&A lawyer, every deal's got subject matter expert questions. And, especially at Verizon, which had a huge legal department, I had to be, in tight with the IP lawyer, the tax lawyer, the benefits lawyer, the commercial lawyers, because, I'm creating work for them. I need you to review this. I need you to do this diligence. I need you to get on a call and negotiate this provision. And people don't always love having work created for them. So, you want to make sure you're buddies with them, give them a real skin in the game. They feel like they have a stake in the transaction, so that, that you can move them along. Communicating up to senior management in the legal department is important. They're very busy people. My general counsel, she's not interested in a 30-page memo on why we should not be doing a joint venture here. She wants, the quick and dirty as to what's wrong with this thing. And that's important to learn how to, law firms, you speak in memos. In-house, you speak in emails and in, kind of Teams chats. And it's important to not over analyze stuff and not to over communicate as well. And I think those are all skills that, as you're in house and you want to move up, you learn to be a team player. You learn to work the way that, people in businesses, not just lawyers, but people inside corporations and businesses work, which is very different than how they work in law firms.
Absolutely. And as the in-house lawyer, you don't have a buffer, right? Of, coming as an associate, maybe you had a partner to bounce things off of but you're really independently having to learn how to manage all those internal relationships, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
The next thing I wanted to ask you about is your advice for our lawyers who are serving clients like yourself. And I imagine in your almost 20 years in-house, you have managed hundreds or thousands of outside counsel teams. So
A lot.
tell us
A lot.
Tell us a little bit about what the best ones did. Like, what can they do to impress you?
A couple things. First is understand your client's business. Okay. You don't need to know it as well as I do. I don't expect you to know as well as I do. I do expect if that, there is an article in a journal about your client, you're aware of it. Okay. You ought to have some sense of don't read the whole K, read the description of the business, kind of get a feel for what the client does, what the issues are, what they see as kind of risks in the business, things like that. That's important. The more you know your client, understand client, the better lawyer you are for your client. In terms of kind of interpersonal relationships, I when I was very, very junior, I worked, maybe in a summer associate, actually worked for a partner who talked about the three A's: affability, availability, and ability. And he would always say ability is not always the most important. It is. It's important to be a good lawyer and do good work, but availability is critical. I'm calling you. I need to talk to you about something. I don't call to chit chat because, first of all, these people bill me, thousands of dollars an hour. And I won't have to pay for, idle conversation. So I really need something. So I understand you have other things going on. I don't expect you to answer the phone every time. I do expect you to get back to me in a reasonable amount of time. Affability, I expect you to be pleasant. I expect you to be nice. I expect you to follow my lead in terms of, dealing with the other side. If I say, this is a deal, we have a good relationship with these guys. We need to be warm and fuzzy. You need to be warm and fuzzy. If that's not your negotiating style, if I say, okay, this one's tough. I need you to, I'm going to try to be the good cop. I really need you to play the bad cop here, which is something I do quite often actually with outside counsel. They need to be, difficult, even if that's not their personality as well. So, that's important. Ask me questions. Okay. If I say something, I need X, Y, Z, and you're not sure exactly how I want X, Y, Z or what X, Y, Z is, ask me. Okay. I'm much happier to get on a call and, go through it and say, this is what I'm thinking. And, then give me a work product I don't want. You should also debate with me. If I say, on this issue, I think we should do X, and, you think I'm just, out there and we should be doing Y instead. Tell me why. That's an important piece of it. I'm paying for your intelligence and your experience and your wisdom and judgment. So, don't feel free. I mean, not in front of the other side, but feel free. I think we should handle the issue this way. Feel free to say, no, I think you're just, you're smoking dope, Stuart, and we should be handling it this other way because you're creating too much risk for yourself. And I listen. I don't always agree, and sometimes say no, I want to do it. Or sometimes say, oh, I think you're right. So you should feel free to push back on me and debate with me. That's kind of important skill set. And no matter who you are, it doesn't matter if you're the senior partner on a deal or the junior associate on a deal. You have an opinion, and I know law firms work to filter this certain ways, whatever. But you have an opinion. You're obviously if you're at a firm like Reed Smith, you're smart. And you should be able to, opine if you think I'm heading the wrong way.
That's a really powerful point, that a respectful, desire to thought partner with you is appreciated by you as long as it's done in the right way. And even from an associate, because some associates out there might not realize that would be valuable to you as the client.
Absolutely. And if I think, and look, I think if you're a junior associate and I think you're going the wrong way, I'll say, I don't think you're doing it right, and here's why. I'm happy to explain my thinking. That's how they get better. I'm happy. I realize I'm not the partner. It's not my primary role to train associates, but if I'm working on a deal, I'm happy to kind of say, hey, this is why I think about the way I do, and something to keep in mind.
So you mentioned what impresses you. Are there any particular pain points that you would highlight that you've experienced in the past with outside counsel?
Sure. Over lawyering, in terms of overstaffing transactions, calls, whatever. I usually don't need 8 attorneys from the law firm on a call. I use the right lawyer for the job. I like a deal team with a strong senior associate because that's the person who really runs the deals and who I like to interact with. I need a partner for certain things, obviously, and I will talk to partners about things I need to talk to partners about, major deal issues or problems or the like. But, on a day to day, hey, I need to get, we need to try to draft the document or, working on disclosure schedules or whatnot. I'd much rather deal with a kind of a mid-level associate or senior associate than a partner, just because it's more economic and that person's closer to this stuff anyway. So so staff the right number of people at the right level is important, and don't overstaff and don't staff rung level. Talk to availability. It drives me nuts if I call an attorney and I don't get called back for 2 days. I know you have other clients. I kind of like to think that you don't. That should be transparent. It should be as if you don't. I understand you do. Okay. Meet deadlines. I try very hard not to give nonsense fake deadlines, either to outside counsel or to internal lawyers or stakeholders as well. So, I try to be reasonable. I try to give people as much time as I can. But look, things happen. And it has happened. I've made that call at 4 o'clock on a Friday to some poor, partner or associate at some law firm and ruin somebody's weekend. I know I've done that. I try not to, but it happens. Sorry, we're paying a lot of money. We're going to have to deal with it. So be available and make deadlines. Tell me if the deadline's not makeable too, because I've done that where I've said I need this tomorrow. Like, look, Stuart, I got to talk to tax. I got to talk. We're not, and like, okay, I understand. Let me push back internally. Tell me up front you're not going to make a deadline, as opposed to telling me the time the deadline is there. The other thing, and this is a funny one, get rest. I can tell when lawyers been like on some other transaction up for 3 nights in a row because the quality of the work, as a client, I can see it diminish significantly. I won't say what law firm it was. He was a great associate. He obviously had some other deal going on, and he sent me a whole bunch of closing documents for our general counsel to sign. And everything was general counsel at Verizon time was male, and everything was she and her. And obviously he didn't look closely at his documents. I'm like, how long you been up for? He said about 40 hours. I'm like, go to bed, have a good night's sleep. Send me these tomorrow because this isn't working. Okay, you know. Well, I wasn't going to get any useful work product out of him when I was asleep anyway. So, it may have been kind of maybe my self interest, but if you pull an all nighter to even as a junior associate, I mean, I'm 51 now. I just if I do one of those, I'm dead. But even as a junior associate, when you can handle a little bit, no, it's the quality of work diminishes and the clients can see it. So don't do that. Other than that, seamless coordination within your law firms is important. Especially at Footlocker, where I don't have as many internal experts as I do at Verizon, and I'm relying more on the outside counsel for subject matter expertise. That should all kind of come to me, kind of generally through the corporate lawyer in a nice package. I don't want to have to manage your team. That's your job. Trying to think what else kind of drives me nuts, but that's a good summary of it.
That's a great
Good summary.
list. I want to go back. You mentioned something really important about the senior associate being your preferred person who's like the key person, the anchor on the deal, running it, escalating stuff to the partner when necessary, delegating to the junior lawyers when necessary.
Right.
Do you, given that's your preferred main contact, can you talk a little bit more about junior associates? Our audience is mostly associates in their first 3 years
Sure.
of practice. So do you even notice them? Do you see their impact?
I noticed them. Okay. I do notice them. They are on the emails. They are on the calls. They do speak up on occasion. I will speak to them about issues at times. I certainly notice them. Do they have an impact? I assume so. It's easier, it's somewhat opaque to me as a client because the stuff comes over and I'm not always sure who did what over at the law firm. If it's quality work, it's good. It's quality work. But it's a little hard for me to tell what they have their hands in and what they don't. Sometimes I do have, look, if I'm talking directly to the juniors, it's usually disclosure schedules and closing documents, things like that. They definitely have an impact there for sure. But in terms of I hope the law firm, I hope Reed Smith, is making sure those juniors are being trained as they go along in the deal. I suspect they are, but on the client side, it's not always easy to tell, kind of who's doing what over there. But I suspect they have an impact.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. And just to go back to what you said earlier, that time that you noticed that an associate was tired, not performing well. I just want to echo that sometimes taking care of yourself is part of client service because the client does, they're human and they see you as a human.
There's a law of diminishing returns after all for sure.
I think that's something I had to learn the hard way. So I'm glad that we're telling others. Well, on that note, you mentioned your age, so I don't think that you'll be offended if I can safely observe we're about the same age, and it's been a minute since we were both new lawyers. So with that perspective, and now being in-house and seeing so many new lawyers working on your matters, could you talk a little bit about what you think the biggest change has been since we were starting out to now?
Hmm. There are a few. First of all, everything is online or remote now. Even look, you still go to the office, but traveling for negotiations is not done nearly as much. I wouldn't say not at all, but not done nearly as much. In-person closings, I don't remember the last in-person closing that I had on a deal. I started out, they had those, those big metal folder holders. They stick the folders in there, and you'd be walking around a table and making sure everyone had their signature pages. So a lot, and I think it's a little unfortunate because I think, in some way, not the closings, not the closings, but the negotiations, because, when you're in the same room with someone, I think in some ways it's a little easier to negotiate. Sometimes you would have dinner beforehand, you get to know each other a little bit, and it makes for a little smoother negotiation. And I miss that a little bit. And so that's a big change. I think the pace has picked up a bit because, when I first started practicing, we weren't doing we were still, faxing documents back and forth and signature pages being FedExed. And now, everything is somewhat instantaneous. I mean, these associates who are listening, they're like, oh my God, this guy's old. But, it was, so the pace has picked up. I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing. There's no, there are times on deals where I think when I first started, maybe you had an opportunity to catch your breath that you don't necessarily have now. But the nuts and bolts of the practice hasn't changed, and the deal issues, have remained the same. I mean, look, I remember when I was a couple of years out, there's a big push on what are you going to about Y2K reps and every computer falling apart. Obviously, that's not an issue now. Now it's, how do we make sure that, our MAE and our operating covenants deal with the fact that it could be a pandemic. So, issues change too, depending on what goes on in the world. But the practice is similar, other than some of those, changes. Though, ask me again in 5-10 years with the AI coming up, who knows? Maybe that'll have huge impacts on it too. But it's not, at least from an in-house M&A practice, I'm not seeing a whole lot of that yet.
Mm. I'm often reminded when people talk about the change in technology and the way we practice of when I was a junior associate, the partner I was working for telling me that he had always appreciated having a break when you had to mail the documents to Europe. And then the fax machine came and it was all over. You didn't get to rest. So in some way I feel like these are changes, but maybe AI is something that we've never seen.
Exactly.
All right, so I have to let you go, but last question.
Sure.
Given that you're in, an in-house role that I think many young M&A lawyers in particular would love to aspire to, what's one piece of advice you would give to someone kind of starting out, maybe they're a third year, who wants to end up in a position like yours?
One thing, become a good lawyer, understand how to do deals, work with more senior lawyers who are good teachers. I worked for a partner at one time who may not have been the warmest, fuzziest guy in the world, but every time I worked with him, instead of just sending me comments a document, he had me come into his office and he sat down and explained what changes he was making. Okay, that's the better person to attach yourself to than a partner who may be a wonderful human being, great guy, always buying the drinks at the bar after work, but just takes your changes, makes what he needs, and sends off the client. You're not going to learn anything. Okay, because that. Because when you're in a house, you need to know what you're doing and how to do it and do it well. There's no one here to teach you. So to kind of take advantage of the learning opportunities at the law firm that you're not going to get later, I think is a big piece of it. And if there's one thing I would say, that would be the one.
Oh, that's great advice. Well, thank you so much, Stuart, for spending time with us. I learned a ton from this conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Laura. I really appreciate it.
So thank you all for joining us for another episode of Reed Smith's Alumni Career Footprints podcast. We hope to see you again in a future episode. Thanks so much, everyone. Career Footprints is a Reed Smith production. Our producers are Allie McCardle and Shannon Ryan. You can find our podcast on podcast streaming platforms, reedsmith.com, and our social media accounts at Reed Smith LLP. To learn more about Reed Smith's Alumni Network, Or if you are an alum of the firm who wants to share your career story, contact Laura Karmatz, Reed Smith's Global Senior Director of Alumni Relations, at alumni@reedsmith.com.
This podcast is provided for educational purposes. It does not constitute legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship, nor is it intended to suggest or establish standards of care applicable to particular lawyers in any given situation. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Any views, opinions, or comments made by any external guest speaker are not to be attributed to Reed Smith LLP or its individual lawyers. All rights reserved.